The dishwasher loading is his territory. Heaven forbid I should put a dish in there, not in the right place.
I know where everything goes.
It's never good enough, but it's in there.
Either a dishwasher or somebody that likes to do the dishes would be great.
I'm the only one that does it.
That's not true.
I am the dishwasher.
Not at our house, but when I babysit, I do.
Our robot does the vacuuming.
You should make the kids do it more.
What's vacuuming?
Yes, I can't stand dirt in my feet.
I don't know the last time I picked up a vacuum. I don't do that. I'm too lazy.
I like to vacuum, actually. I really enjoy it.
I don't ever make mine.
You don't?
Okay, well, I make my bed.
It's been over a month.
Neither of us.
Sometimes after he makes the bed, I have to remake the bed.
I always make the bed because Craig Rochelle told me I have to.
I never make the bed.
Well, we are so glad that you guys are here with us today as we wrap up our series, It's Complicated. And listen, before we get rolling here real quick, let me just give a quick shout out to Parker Hill Church. We are so glad that you are joining us here at LCBC today. Some of us are clapping in the room, and I'll take that. Very glad to have you guys here with us today. And we continue, just so you know, at Parker Hill, we continue to just be very excited about all the ways in which God may be leading our churches to continue to join together to reach more people in the days ahead. It's been a lot of fun over the last 5 weeks, even for our churches to be walking through this series. It's complicated. And if you haven't been around, we've been talking about, I'll catch you up real quick, we've been talking about how to best navigate the really difficult and sometimes tricky landscape of relationships. We've talked about being single, we've talked about marriage, we've talked about dating, and which means all of this. There are really only a few more topics related to romantic relationships left to cover. And so you knew it was coming, and today we need to talk about this. That's how you make it awkward, right there, right? And some of you, you're nervous right now. And some of you, you brought a friend today for the very first time, and I'm giving you permission to lean over to them real quick and just say, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. But here's why we have to talk about sex. And yeah, you can say that in church. Here's why we got to talk about sex. Because you're already talking about it. And you're thinking about it. And you're either having it, or you're not having it, but wishing you were having it, or you're not having it, and you're not wishing you were having it, but everybody around you is telling you you should be wishing you were having it. The conversation, here's my point, the conversation's already happening all around us. And today, here's who I want to talk to specifically. I just want to drill in on and kind of hone in on singles. I want to talk to you if you're single. I want to talk to you if you're a high schooler, I want you to lean in. College age, I want you to lean in. If you're older and you're single, lean in a little bit. Maybe you're single again after a divorce or after a loss. And I want to tell you some of the things that the married people sitting around you right now wish someone would have told them years ago. Because the reality is this, is that for some of us who are married, who maybe had a different perspective on sex years ago, some of us are living with a lot of regrets. And some of the people sitting around you are living with consequences, some of them years later, from decisions that they were made related to sex that have carried over in their implications years and years later. You see, one of the things that's true about sex is this. We all have a script that we've been handed about sex. In other words, we all have been handed a story or a narrative or a script about sex, about what it is, about its purpose, about its value, about what makes for good sex. We've all been handed a script. When I was 9 years old, I remember this like it was yesterday. Man, I was 9 years old. We were living at Shawfield Court in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I remember going down to the creek to play with some of my friends, and I came across this. I'm going down the creek. I know this sounds cliched, but it's true as anything. I walked down there, and there was this construction site where they were building some new homes. And so this creek's down there, and we're playing, and I look up, and I see these papers laying about 20 feet away. And I notice it's a magazine. And on this magazine is something that I had not seen before, a naked woman. And I ran to that magazine. And I did for the next 30 minutes what, a lot of 9-year-old boys probably do, this. And then I did what the person before me had done, and more than likely what the person before them had done. And I took it and I threw it on the ground. Like it was trash, discarded it, like it was a used napkin. And here's what I didn't know about that day. What I didn't know about that day was that a script started forming in my mind and in my life about women, about bodies, about sex. And you've been given a script as well. And we don't even know we're handed a script. We're just handed it. And today, I just want to give you another script. I want to give you an alternative story about sex that some of you may have never heard it before. And the script I want to talk about today, it's one that you're going to find yourself, at some point as we talk today, you're going to find yourself compelled by the things we're going to talk about. And at the very same time, you're going to find yourself resisting. Because everything we're going to talk about today is going to sound absurd. But the reason that the things we'll talk about today, this new script that I want to hand you related to sex, the reason it will sound absurd is because you have been conditioned to see sex a particular way. Through conversations with friends, through rumors, through stories, through media, through porn, and it is everywhere, and it has overwhelmed us. And one particular lie, and there's one particular lie that we've picked up along the way about sex that we need to address today. And it's a really simple lie, and it's this: sex is just physical. You know, sex is just physical. Not a really big deal, like it's just a physical thing. It's just like a biological impulse that, you know, when you feel it, just do it, right? Just follow through on it. It's just physical. It's just like a really intense fist bump. Really, really intense fist bump. Like that's what it is, right? Just physical. And yet, at some level, we all intuitively know that's not true. But the reality is, while we may know that it's more than just physical, that there's something different about sex than every other physical thing, nobody wants to talk about it. You know why? Because that sells a lot of movies. Sex is just physical, nothing more. That sells a lot of movies. That makes for a lot of books. That makes for way better stories when you're hanging out in your dorm room. But something in us knows that's not the whole story. I mean, think about it, guys. If sex were just physical, why is it that for any of us who have felt the sting of sexual abuse, why is it that decades later, we still feel the effects of what was done to us? Decades later, we're not going to a counselor and talking 20 years later about the kid who shoved us on the playground when we were in 4th grade. That was just physical, but not sex. If sex were just physical, why is it that some men get so enraged and jealous when after a relationship that got sexual ends? You wouldn't feel that way with people that you've just shaken hands with. You wouldn't feel that way with people you've just hugged, because that's just physical, but not sex. If sex were just physical, why is it that nobody here, it doesn't matter, you can be here today and some of you, you're not religious, you're not Bible, you're not Jesus, you're just here because someone invited you or you're just tuning in for whatever reason. You don't know if you believe any of this. And still, every single one of us, there's not a person in here right now that if you had a friend who was married and said, you know what, I'm thinking about cheating on my wife, I'm thinking about cheating on my husband, you would say, go for it. It's just physical. Why is that? Why are breakups so much more complicated and difficult when sex is involved? Why is it that we stay longer with someone who we know is toxic, who we know is not good to us or good for us when sex is involved? Why is it that trust issues have followed some of us into our marriages related to sex? And us knowing that our spouse was really casual in their sex lives before we settled down for marriage. Why is it that we can't get past that? Here's why. It's because sex is more than just physical. And guys, just please lean in. Singles, lean in for a second because this is everything I want to say today in about one sentence right here. If you treat sex like it's just physical, it will inevitably lead to regret that could be avoided. If you treat sex like it's just physical, it will inevitably lead to regret that could be avoided. Guys, it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. In fact, this is partly what is behind some really powerful words from the Old Testament. And they're found in the book of Proverbs. Proverbs were written by Solomon, and it is a collection of these wise sayings, these wisdom statements. And there's this one section in the beginning of the book of Proverbs that speaks a ton about sex and what happens when we treat sex like it's just physical. And so if you have a Bible, I'd love for you to turn to Proverbs chapter 5. If you on your mobile device, if you want to scroll there, Proverbs chapter 5. And let me just tell you real quick that the setting for this passage, the setting for the words that we're about to read right here from Solomon, this is Solomon talking to his sons. So he's trying to give them fatherly advice. He's trying to give them fatherly wisdom based on God's principles. But the principles, as you're about to see and we'll experience here in just a moment, they extend to all of us. And so when Solomon wants to share words of wisdom about why we cannot afford to treat sex casually and like it's just physical, here's what he says. This is in chapter 5. Look at verse 7. It says, "So now, my sons, listen to me. Never stray from what I'm about to say." It's almost like he says, listen, you got to put this thing in concrete. You got to set this thing in stone. You got to listen up, lean in, because what I'm about to tell you is so important. This is what he says. "Stay away from her. Don't go near the door of her house." Who? That girl you just want to use for sex. The girl you want to treat sex with so casually. Again, let's just apply this. If he's talking to his daughters, he's saying, that guy who wants sex but doesn't want any commitment, that guy who wants to say, just stay away. Sex is more than physical. He says, don't go near the door. If you do, you'll lose your honor, and you will lose to merciless people all that you've achieved. Strangers will consume your wealth, and someone else will enjoy all of the fruit of your labor. In the end, you will groan in anguish when disease consumes your body. You will say, listen to this, "Oh, how I hated discipline, if only." That's a powerful two-word statement right there. If only. If only, if only, if only. If only I had not ignored all the warnings. Oh, why didn't I listen to my teachers? Why didn't I pay attention to my instructors? I have come to the brink of utter ruin, and now I must face public disgrace. Guys, listen. This is someone who understands regret. These are the words of someone who's experienced regret relationally, physically, emotionally, sexually. And I don't want to pull any punches with you here today. The reality is this: there's people sitting all around you right now who have their own if-only moments. That if you were to ask them, there's people sitting around you right now, if you were to ask them what some of the greatest regrets in their life were, they would not tell you about that bad financial investment they made. They wouldn't tell you about the thing that they bought that they never use. They wouldn't tell you about the job opportunity that they took or they didn't take. They would look you in the eye and they would tell you about a time in their life when they treated sex like it was just physical. If only. If only I had known then what I know now. If only. I wish I had never. I don't know what I was thinking. These are the kinds of things you would hear. I thought it was just a spring break thing. I thought it was just a college thing. I thought it was just a one-night thing. I didn't think he'd ever leave me. I didn't think she'd ever leave me. If only. If only, if only. Guys, when we treat sex like it's just physical, it will inevitably lead to regret that could be avoided. And by the way, man, this isn't just a Bible thing. These principles are true because they're just fundamentally true about life, which is interesting because then research comes behind it and supports so often what God says is the best way to live. Some of the most extensive research about the sexual practices and the mindset of 18 to 23-year-olds in America was done just a few years ago by a couple of sociologists who were, I think at that point, they were at the University of Texas. And in their work and in their research, again, the largest at that point study and survey of sexual practices of 18 to 23-year-olds, not a Christian survey, has nothing to do with that. And in their work, what they discovered, there's one entire chapter that dives into the way in which 18 to 23-year-olds are trying to detach sex from any other connection other than it being physical. And at the end of this section of their research, this is their conclusion. And remember, these are not Christians coming to this conclusion. This is not trying to angle for something, antiquated and Bible-y and Jesus. This is researchers, sociologists coming to this conclusion. This is what it says. This is what they say in their work. It says, most emerging adults will not experience an unintended pregnancy or a sexually transmitted infection. That's just physical stuff. Most people aren't going to experience that. But, and it's a big one, but have already and will continue to experience regrettable sex. You know what they're saying? What the research finds is that you can treat sex like it's just physical, and you can mitigate all the risks. There's protection for that. You can use protection and you can not risk pregnancy and you can take care of all the physical consequences and still be left with regret. Why? Because sex is so much more beautiful and sacred and powerful than just being a physical act. In fact, the biblical vision for sex, it is so much more beautiful than a purely biological impulse or an expression, a momentary expression of passion. It is an act that fuses two people together in the most intimate of ways. And the biblical response to this is not to avoid sex. Some of you might think that. The biblical response is to put sex in its proper container, in its right context. This is why Solomon says what he says next. He says, so drink water from your own well. Share your love only with your wife. Why would you spill the water of your springs in the streets having sex with just anyone? You should reserve it for yourselves. Never share it with strangers. Let your wife be a fountain of blessing for you. Rejoice in the wife of your youth. She is a loving deer, a graceful doe. All my hunter friends out there, real quick, try that next time. Tell that to your wife, baby, you're a doe. Just see how far you get with that. All right. He says, she's a loving deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast satisfy you always. May you always be captivated by her love. Guys, think about the words being used here in the context of sex. Because depending on your background or maybe how you grew up, this may come as a shock to you that the biblical writers talk, how the biblical writers talk about sex. Blessing, rejoice, satisfied, captivated. These are evocative words, man, describing the gift of sex. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible that is almost entirely, exclusively dedicated to the subject of sex. It's called the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. See, high schoolers, high school guys, you should read your Bible more. This is in there. And guys, this is what's so important. The vision that God lays out for us when it comes to our sexuality, it is not about avoiding anything. It isn't about abstaining. It's not about running away. It isn't about something being bad or gross. The vision that God lays out for us about sexuality is about us running toward something so much greater than sex just being a physical act. But rather that sex is a blessing to be rejoiced over, a satisfying, captivating act that bonds and fuses two people together in the most intimate of ways. And the only relationship worthy, the only relationship strong enough to hold that powder keg of passion that is sex is marriage. Why? Because sex isn't just physical. And it leads to something so much more sacred. This is what's behind a particular passage in the book of Genesis that Jesus quotes at one point. The Apostle Paul quotes it at one point. This passage in Genesis, it runs like a thread all through the scriptures. And it's related to marriage and the purpose and the intent of marriage. It's a passage that describes, in a lot of ways, the very first wedding ceremony in which God brings together a husband and a wife. This is what it says in Genesis chapter 2. It says, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is what? Joined to his wife. And the two are united into what? One. Now the man and his wife were both naked and felt no shame. That's an incredible picture. That they stood naked and unashamed with each other. Imagine sex with no shame, no awkwardness, no guilt, no anxiety, no insecurity, no wondering if you're being compared to someone else. Just pure, unfiltered joy. That's what God created. And the words that stand out to me in this passage, the words that are so critically important, are the words joined in one. The two lives become one, joined together. In fact, the word for join, the word that's translated joined in that Genesis passage, it can actually just mean glued together. I've shared this with some of you before, but I've got a family member who used to be an engineer for a lumber company down south. And he was telling me about just kind of the way that they operate. And one of the things that they would do is once they would process trees that would come through their plant, there would always be pieces of these trees, like scrap pieces that would kind of be left on the floor or whatever, all over the place. And so they needed to figure out something to do with it to still make money off of it and all this kind of stuff. And so they would take those pieces, those individual pieces of wood, they would mix them together with incredibly strong adhesive, incredibly strong glue, and then they would put it through a machine that would bring it under intense heat and pressure, and it would put form to it. And on the other side, what once were separate things come out on the other side as one. Something new. That's marriage. It's two autonomous human beings being fused together in every way. And God says, sex, that's the glue. That's like the glue that brings these two together, that makes you one with someone else. And God is saying the only relationship strong enough to hold that kind of untamed, fierce power of sex is marriage, because marriage explicitly states that I belong to you and you belong to me, and we are committed to each other in every way. Economically, we're one. Socially, we're committed to each other. We're one. Relationally, emotionally, legally, and sexually. We exclusively belong to each other. And sex was intended to thrive under those conditions, where you are assured that you will always be loved and you will never be left. And we have the choice. And we have the choice. We have the choice to go, and we can glue ourselves to lots of different people. And we can make ourselves one with lots of different people. But the true power of sex, to build trust, to solidify the connection of intimacy with the other, it will lose its power. See, this is the irony. The irony is this. See, we think that sex will bring us together with someone else, will make us feel more connected to the person that we're having sex with. But when you choose to have sex with someone that you also don't have a marital commitment from, a commitment for life from, you will inevitably guard parts of yourself from that person. You will instinctively do it. Why? Because you don't know if they'll be around tomorrow, or in a month, or in a year. So ironically, the sacred potential of sex to connect us actually loses its power. Because without the assurance of commitment, we cannot be fully ourselves with the other person. And so we detach sex from its true power, making it just a physical thing, treating it as if it's just physical while longing for it to be something more. And you know this, and some of you have felt this, that this is why there may be no greater sting to the human soul than the sting that comes when we've tasted being one with someone only to have it ripped apart with shrapnel going everywhere. That's what happens. And here's why. You can't unone what's already been won. You can separate it. You can break it apart. That's not what I'm talking about. But there will always be a piece of this that is embedded in here that you cannot separate out. And there's pieces of this embedded in here that you can't extrapolate and separate out. It's one. You can't unone what's been won. Not without there being shards of splintering wood flying all over the place, leaving jagged edges sharp enough to cut. It wasn't intended to be this way, guys. And God's invitation for how we treat our sexuality, it is so much more dignifying, so much more affirming of humanity, of our bodies, so much more expansive than what is currently being offered to us, that it's just a physical act. Naked, unashamed, beautiful, intimate, fearless sex. That's what God has for us. And the only relationship worthy of that passionate, explosive power, the only relationship that can stand up to the heat that our sexuality brings is marriage. Where at the end of the day, you will be loved without fear of being left. And I realize that there's a couple of objections to all of this. I told you, something in you is probably going to be compelled by this, and other parts of you are going to resist it. My guess is some of you have some objections as I'm sitting here talking, and you might be thinking because of the script about sex that you've been handed. Here's one objection. Yep, Jason, hear you. Yeah. Sounds great. But how are we going to know we have chemistry if we don't have sex? Here's what I'd say to that. Commitment fuels chemistry. Commitment fuels chemistry, not the other way around. In other words, we tend to think that we need to know if there's sexual chemistry before making a commitment, but it actually works backwards. Commitment and exclusiveness is what fuels chemistry. When you know that you belong to someone else, that breeds romance that you cannot replicate any other way. One conversation I can promise you will not have with your future spouse if you end up getting married one day is this. Man, aren't you glad we did all that stuff with all those other people to find out we didn't have chemistry with them? Commitment fuels chemistry. Here's the second objection some of you are probably thinking. Yeah, but isn't this repressive? This feels antiquated. This feels repressive. You see, the reality is there's this idea out there that we should all be true to our feelings. And anything we do that isn't true to our feelings is repressive. We're not being true to ourselves, which is a ridiculous thought. I wish I had more time to unpack. But let me just say this. The idea is that if we curb our appetites or we maintain discipline in an area, that feels repressive. But we don't think about any other area of life that way. If you went to your friends and you said that you want to start getting healthier, you would make certain choices in order to pursue health. You would avoid certain foods. You would avoid certain activities that do not lead to health. And nobody would say that you're being repressive by doing that. In fact, they would cheer you on and they would celebrate that you are making choices to pursue something better. There is nothing repressive about knowing that you want something better in the area of sex and you make choices consistent with that vision for something better. And guys, there's something better out there. And this is why Solomon wraps up this passage by asking a question. It's almost like he says, so in light of all that, in light of what's out there, in light of you don't have to live this way right here, in light of all that, in light of the oneness and intimacy and connection and unashamed freedom that God has for you to experience in sexuality, he asks a why question in light of what's possible. This is how he wraps it up in verse 20. He just says, so why be captivated, my son, by an immoral woman or fondle the breasts of a promiscuous woman? And again, if he's talking to women, he says, so why be captivated by a guy who's going to want oneness from you in this way but not from any other way? In other words, why would you treat sex as if it was just physical? I love how one translation says this verse. Why would you trade enduring intimacies for cheap thrills? Why would you give your body over to that? Don't you know that you are so much more valuable? Don't you know that sex is so much more beautiful than just a physical act? Don't you know that you could have something so much greater? And don't you know that you're worth that? That you have a heavenly Father, the God who created you in love, who thinks you're worth that? Women, let me just talk to you for a second. I want you to know you are worthy. Women, you are worthy of the highest commitment, of fidelity, of love. You are worthy of being cherished. You are worthy of safety and security in every way. You were bought with a price. You are worthy of commitment. Men, I want you to know, men, just listen. You are so much stronger than you realize. You do not have to just give in to every impulse that comes your way. You have been bought with a price. You are valuable and you are capable of giving honor, of living in a way that brings honor and respect and love to all women that you come across who have been created in God's image. You are not destined to just use people. contrary to the script that you've been given. And let me just say that as we wrap up, I realize that some of you are here and you're tuning in right now and you've got your own if only moments related to sex. And it may feel like everything we're talking about today is a bit too late. You're like, man, I wish I would have heard this years ago. I wish I would have heard this last week. And you're living with shame or maybe some consequences of decisions that you've made and you wish you could take back. And here's what I want you to hear today. I want you to hear very loud and clearly today. There are no damaged goods under God's grace. You are not damaged goods. If you've gotten this wrong, if you've gotten this messed up, if you're carrying some of that around, I just want you to know you are not damaged goods. There are only second chances. There is only grace. There is only forgiveness with Jesus Christ. And he heals those parts of us that we bring to him. And today is a new day. And your past does not have to define you in the area of your sexuality. And so in response today, I just want to ask you a really simple question. Leslie asked this question last week. I thought it was a great one. I don't know if you'll ever get married or if you'll ever be remarried. I don't know what the future holds for you, but if you do, let me just ask you this question. What story do you want to tell your spouse one day? What's the story you want to tell about your sexuality? With regards to how you used your body, with how you treated the incredible gift of your sexuality. Because you could tell a story, there's a couple of options with this. You could tell a story like so many other people's stories. And it goes like this. I mean, I've always seen sex like it's just physical. And you know that you're just one of many. And the best thing for my mental health and probably your mental health as we go into this marriage would probably just be, let's just let our past be the past. I won't bring it up if you don't bring it up. That's one story. That's expected. And to be frank with you, that's easy. Or you could tell a different story one day. You could one day say, you know what? I used to think that sex was just physical. And yes, I have a past, and I made some mistakes related to how I treated sex. But there was this day, there was this moment when my perspective on sex shifted. And it moved beyond just being something physical and into something so much more beautiful and dynamic and God-inspired than just two bodies coming together, but that instead I began to see sex as God-created, intimacy-gluing, power-packed expression of love that thrives in the context of marriage. And wouldn't it be amazing? Just listen, wouldn't it be amazing if you could tell your future spouse one day this? What if you could say, and I made a choice that I would honor others and I would honor God by the way I treated this sacred body and God's gift of sex. And I would only open up that gift in the context of marriage. And yes, that choice I made all those months ago or those years ago, that choice, when I said I'm going to do this God's way, that choice, it proved to be extraordinarily difficult at times. And I felt stupid at times. And it didn't make sense to my friends. And my fraternity brothers, they didn't get it. And my roommates, they didn't understand. And it felt like nobody was willing to walk down the same path as I walked. Guys, man, wouldn't it be incredible if you could say this? If you could say, but I want you to know, I did it all with you in mind. And I didn't know your name then. But I know it now. And I don't regret any of it. Here's what I know about you. You want to hear that story. That's the story you want to hear. And it's out there for you. But it's going to mean choosing a new perspective on sex that goes against the prevailing story we've been told. But we all know that the prevailing story we've been handed, it hasn't led to life. And today, we can make a choice to say yes to something greater. And so, just to close our time today, there's a song that we have sung here before. We've sung it a lot of times, actually. But I think this song, it just captures the spirit of what we want to do with these truths. And the song is called God, I Look to You. And in particular, it gives voice to what we need if we're serious about pursuing God's intent for our sexuality. There's two lyrics in particular that just strike me, especially in light of this topic today. It's this: give me vision to see things like you do, God. Give me wisdom, because you know just what to do. Guys, isn't that what we need? We so badly need this in the area of sex. New vision, a better vision than the one so many of us have been handed. That his way is wise, even when it's challenging. It's best, even when it's difficult. And that if we choose to say, God, I need your vision, I'm going to follow through on your vision for my life in the area of sexuality, I promise you, he's not going to let you down. He's never going to let you down. And so as you listen to the song, as we sing this over you, and if God's stirring something up in your heart today, that it's time to make a choice to see things differently in the area of sex, listen to that prompting right now. Because today can be a new day that leads to somewhere better.